This is Module 1, Lesson 6. Here we're looking at the properties of the real numbers. First, we have the commutative property of addition and the commutative property of multiplication. Both of these properties tell us that we're allowed to add or likewise multiply in either order and get the same result. So for example, 10 plus 2 is the same as 2 plus 10. Either way I add them, I get 12. Similarly, 10 times 2 is 2 times 10. Either way I multiply, I get 20. I like to remember this property by thinking about commuting from home to school. Either way I drive, whether it's from home to school or school to home, I still have to drive the same distance. Next, we have the associative property of addition and the associative property of multiplication. These two properties tell us that we're allowed to regroup addition or regroup multiplication and get the same answer either way. So for example, for addition, we're saying that if I have 8 plus 2 plus 3, I can group this as 8 plus the quantity 2 plus 3, or alternatively, I could group that 8 plus 2 first, and then do the 3 at the end. So first we're saying that I'm doing 8 plus 2 plus 3 is 5, which 8 plus 5 is 13, or I could do 8 plus 2 first to get 10, then add in that 3, and 10 plus 3 is still 13. So either way I group, I get the same result. Similarly for multiplication, I could do 8 times, grouping the 2 times 3 first, or I could group the 8 times 2 first, then do the times 3. So in this first case, I'm doing 8 times, well I grouped the 2 times 3, so I'm multiplying those and getting 6. 8 times 6 is 48. Or alternatively, I could say first do 2 times 8 and get 16, multiply that times 3, 16 times 3 is still 48. So the grouping doesn't change the answer. I like to remember these properties by thinking of the word associates. My associates are a group of people that I work with. So I can think of associates as a group and associative property as a grouping property. Next, we have the identity property of addition and the identity property of multiplication. For addition, this tells us that when 0 is added to a number, the number doesn't change its value. So 4 plus 0 is still 4. Here, 0 is called the additive identity. Similarly, the multiplicative identity tells us that we can multiply a number by 1 and keep its value. So 4 times 1 is still 4. Here, 1 is called the multiplicative identity. Next, we have the additive inverse and the multiplicative inverse. These properties are closely related to the additive identity and multiplicative identity. For the additive inverse, we're told that if the opposite of a number, its additive inverse, is added to that number, the result will be 0, which is the additive identity. So for example, 4 plus negative 4 is 0. Similarly, for the multiplicative inverse property, if the reciprocal of a number, its multiplicative inverse, is multiplied by the number, then the result is 1, which is the multiplicative identity. So for example, 4 times 1/4 is 1. To keep the identity and inverse properties straight, I always think about what it is I'm working with. For the identity property, I'm adding 0 or multiplying by 1, which is the identity. Whereas for the inverse property, I'm adding the opposite or multiplying by the reciprocal, which is the inverse. Lastly, we have the distributive property. The distributive property tells us that multiplication distributes over addition. So, for example, we have 3 times 4 plus 5, and we're saying that this 3 distributes over that addition to be 3 times 4 plus 3 times 5. So looking at this in two ways. First, 3 times 4 plus 5 could be thought of as 3 times, well, 4 plus 5 is 9, and 3 times 9 is 27. Alternatively, I can think of this as 3 times 4, which is 12, plus 3 times 5, which is 15. 12 plus 15 is 27. Now let's look at several examples. We need to name the property that's illustrated. So first, 10 plus y equals y plus 10. Well, I can see that this is talking about addition, so I definitely know that it's an additive property. And all we're doing in this example is switching the order, commuting the elements, so this must be the commutative property of addition. For the second example, I'm doing -2 times -1/2 and getting out 1. Here, I'm multiplying a number by its inverse, by its reciprocal. So this must be the multiplicative inverse. Next, we have 8 times the quantity 10 plus 7, which is equal to 8 times 10 plus 8 times 7. Here you can see we're distributing the 8 across that addition, so this must be the distributive property. Now we have 4 times y times 6 is equal to 4 times y times 6. Here you can see we're grouping the first two, or grouping the second two elements in multiplication. So whenever I group things, I think of associating with them, so this is the associative property of multiplication. Now I have 0 plus 6 is equal to 6. So here we're adding 0 to a number. 0 is the additive identity, so this must be the additive identity property. Now I have x times -13 is equal -13 times x. Here you can see that we're switching the order in multiplication. I'm commuting the elements, so this is the commutative property of multiplication. Now I have the quantity 4 plus y plus 6 is equal to 4 plus the quantity y plus 6. You can see we're grouping elements within addition, so this must be the associative property of addition. Lastly, I have -23 plus 23 is equal to 0. Here we're adding the opposite of -23, which is positive 23. The opposite is the inverse, remember, so this must be the additive inverse.